America has experienced many highs and lows since the time it declared its independence, and the people of this great nation have felt these times. Many suffered during the Great Depression, and others rejoiced when World War II ended. Americans felt the tensions during the times of segregation and the unity in the aftermath of September 11th. Few could have experienced all of these events in their lifetime, but one thing was always there through it all: music. Music has found a way into the lives of people and is sung or played in times of despair, joy, sorrow, and thanksgiving. Jazz is a representation of America itself, is the melting pot of music, the improv of problems, and the reflection of emotion. Jazz was produced and became the heart of American culture in the early 20th century through the encounters and exchange of peoples from various cities that led to the Harlem Renaissance. To understand jazz, you must understand its origin. The earliest form of music that can be traced from civilized America is from African nations and their tribes. Their various sounds and beats created a type of style called heterophonic. The overlapping of different sounds creates a texture that captivates the listener. In many ways, jazz uses this technique as well. Musicians are able to pick up his or her instrument and play while others join in. Jazz is also the heart of improv, with rarely any sheet music or direction used. Over the years, their songs were sung by slaves and indentured servants brought to America through triangular trade. Dr. Kevin Wallen, a professor of the history of jazz, describes the foreground that leads up to the integration and meshing of early slave songs.
Initially, when slaves were brought over to, at this time it was the New World, to the southern United States, there was the West African traditions from where the majority of the slaves were imported come over to the southern United States, and so we have a transmission of some of their music, which gets combined and evolves as part of the music of the slaves in the South. From this tradition, we see things like work songs, field hollers, cakewalks, a lot of different traditional African music.
Over generations, those songs would turn into the hymns slaves sang as they worked. Common songs that many have heard were produced during the time of the Underground Railroad: Follow the Drinking Gourd or Wade in the Water. As slavery came to a close, other racial issues arose, and the songs sang for freedom were then used to show the struggle for equality and expound upon the joy felt once people could start a new life. The traveling of African Americans from the South to more urbanized areas in hopes for more equality and a better life became known as the Great Migration. The music written during this time reflected the joys and tribulations of racial pride felt by the migrants. One of the biggest cities that played a role in the Great Migration was Kansas City. When asked how big a role did Kansas City play in the Great Migration, educational manager for the Kansas City Jazz Museum, Mr. Bill McKimmey, states, Kansas City was the first stop northward from the Deep South, bringing with them more cultural groups, bands, plays, and every kind of entertainment. With the arrival of new culture came new music with Afro-Caribbean traits. The earliest form of blues consisted of Cajun sounds that mixed together with accordion and fiddle playing from the north, in turn producing Zydeco music. These various sounds are likely to have come from New Orleans. Being a port city, New Orleans constantly had new people spreading their musical culture with the people who lived there. Dr. Wallen describes this effect and how important of a factor this played in the production of jazz later on.
Different musical training, different musical ideas. We've got people coming in from the Caribbean, we got people coming in who are traveling from all over the world, and then we have this great mixture of what are the precursors of jazz, the brass bands, ragtime, and all this stuff. And then we have trained musicians who are living side by side.
Much of this cultural interaction led directly to the blues. Blues traveled up the Mississippi Delta, reaching Memphis, which would later become home of the blues. Louisiana was deemed the swamp blues for its deep sound. Atlanta was associated with guitar, producing the largest guitar ensembles of the time. Minstrel shows became popular from the production of these ensembles. William Christopher Handy, father of the blues, traveled cross-country in minstrel shows and quartets, and even performed at the Chicago Exposition that brought many musicians together. He contributed to the Great Migration by traveling to Harlem and starting a publishing company that would print different versions of the blues. Blues was deemed a powerful music that had soul, a close relationship with African American culture, and an integrated part of ragtime. Starting in the 1890s, ragtime boomed. It led to social justices where many whites enjoyed the performance and sound produced by African Americans that could slide their voice over notes. Ragtime also allowed the transition from the strict and moral tradition of the Victorian era to a more relaxed society setting. Ragtime became defined by the quick and distinct short notes called staccato notes played on the piano. During the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, piano specialists taught their own unique sound, which is probably the most influential part of ragtime history. The boom in piano playing led to the growth in the production of flatback pianos that were often seen in saloons. In St. Louis, Tom Turpin's Rosebud Saloon was a black urban tavern that had many white spectators and allowed the opportunity of a famous status. Turpin would scout for young talent, bring them to play, and groom them for the big time. From the saloon came many more like it, but it was not only to help produce performers, it was also to keep them in business. During the early 1900s was the Prohibition age, where the production, selling, and consumption of alcohol was illegal. Therefore, saloons and taverns needed another way to draw people in, and they found it in performers. A rising star during this time was Scott Joplin, who learned music on the cattle trail while moving cattle up from Texas to Missouri. These trails also influenced and helped progress the interactions of music across the United States. Joplin would become most well known for his composition Maple Leaf Rag. Another musician who would gain fame from St. Louis is Louis Armstrong. Originally from New Orleans, Armstrong would travel to St. Louis and join various bands that played on the Mississippi boat lines. Through his career, he'll become most famous for his trumpet playing. These two types of music, ragtime and blues, would flourish for years to come, and the two would later come together to produce the universal sound of jazz. Mr. McKimmey explains the popularity in people going to New York, and specifically Harlem, as New York was the cultural and business capital of America then as now. All musicians who wanted to take their career to a higher level went there for the improved access to the machinery of the music, radio, and film businesses. However, it would lead to much more than personal growth. It would produce an era that grew in the nation. The Harlem Renaissance is one of the biggest periods in American history, not only because of the music. Harlem was a land of opportunity for African Americans during the 20s. Dr. Wallen describes the amount of people this era influenced.
This sort of new artistic hub where poets, scholars, writers, musicians, composers, actors.
One of the biggest influences during this time was Langston Hughes. He was an African American writer who was most known for his integration of jazz rhythm in his poems, such as Dream Deferred and The Weary Blues. In addition to the integration of music with literature, Duke Ellington, a jazz pianist, composer, and band member, also tried to push jazz to its limit. In the recorded interview with Ellington, he describes how he would take sounds from the symphony and try to copy them in his band. Jazz inspired many people to break the boundaries of not only music, but also the stereotypical beliefs of the time. African Americans were opening banks, becoming store owners, hotel managers, and because of the massive boom in cities, they quickly saw how they could reach their goals if they tried hard enough. This was reflected in a news article written in April of 1921, I'd Like to Show You Harlem, by Roland Line Hart. He describes his reactions to the people of Harlem as he tours the city, the pride in the man's voice who showed him the city, the joy in the faces of the people of the street, and most in particular the sound. On every street corner he believed to hear a new sound, similar to the last, but still in some ways different. He claims it was an irresistible sound, most likely because it is hard to not tap your foot or hum a few notes. As the Roaring Twenties gave way to other cultural generations, jazz stayed. It produced an iconic sound that generations will enjoy and be looked at as the music that brought the various cultures of America together. Jazz may not be considered popular or significant in the eyes of today's generation, but it was the start of social barriers being broken. Today, women are fighting for equal pay, people are pushing for legalization of same-sex marriage, and even still African Americans are fighting for social justice. Most of these are done through protest, but what made jazz so great was it broke many barriers with just sound. No violence, no hurtful words, and did not bring others down in the process. I believe jazz came together by the interaction of various peoples and backgrounds to show that every person of every color and of every gender can produce something wonderful, and that performing is only the tip of the iceberg. Media is a powerful tool that can promote and bring people together to do anything, and jazz is just one example. Jazz may not have come from New York, and if taken back to pre-American times, perhaps it never came from America. Through slave trade and the migration of free and runaway slaves, and the interactions of various peoples and backgrounds produced one of the most recognizable times and sounds in history.